The Israeli entity continues its horrendous crimes against the people of Gaza despite a 24-hour humanitarian truce. Palestinian resistance groups respond by firing a barrage of rockets into Israeli settlements. And fierce clashes in Libya between pro-government forces and Islamist militants leave 50 people dead. This is Al Ittijah World News. I'm Zainab Alawi. Israeli occupation forces are continuing their attacks against the Gaza Strip, despite a 24-hour extension of a humanitarian ceasefire, raising the death toll to at least 1,059, while the number of injured Palestinians exceeded 6,000. The Israelis breached the truce by heavily bombarding the besieged enclave using warplanes, warships, and artillery fire. Israeli occupation forces indiscriminately destroyed homes, mosques, hospitals, and even the UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, killing a total of 8 Palestinians on Sunday. Zionist troops on the ground, meanwhile, shot at civilians who were trying to reach their homes in Shuja'iyya, the site of a recent massacre that saw 60 Palestinians killed and targeted a medical team in the middle of a rescue operation in Khan Yunis. Assaults were also intensified against residential areas in the El Zaytun neighborhood and Al Tufah in eastern Gaza on the 20th day of a brutal Israeli offensive. The Israelis are committing these atrocities despite a 24-hour ceasefire, which Hamas agreed upon in response to the United Nations calls and in light of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Now, Palestinian resistance fighters have retaliated against the Israeli entity's persistent massacring of Palestinians by showering Israeli settlements with rains of rockets. Palestinian resistance factions fired rockets from Gaza into Tel Aviv, as well as several Israeli settlements in the southern parts of the occupied territories, injuring at least one settler. The so-called Israeli Iron Dome defense system intercepted only 2 of these rockets. Alert sirens resonated across Israeli settlements, triggering a state of alarm among the Israelis. Al-Qassam Brigade's Hamas's military wing, meanwhile, announced that it fired a volley of rockets into occupied territories while it hit Tel Aviv with M75 missiles. Now, resistance fighters also said they sniped an Israeli soldier east of the Shuja'iyya district in Gaza and shelled Israeli troops near the Al Tufah neighborhood with mortar shells. Well, let's speak to our correspondent in Gaza, Balsam Al-Atrash, for the latest. Balsam, update us on the latest attacks by Israeli occupation forces, despite a 24-hour truce.
Yes, the 24-hour humanitarian truce was disagreed or disapproved by the Israeli side, which means that the Israeli occupation forces continued their air raids and airstrikes despite that Hamas or the Palestinian factions had announced that there is going to be a humanitarian truce for another 24 hours after the 12 hours truce assigned by Israel. So as the Palestinians here assume that there's going to be a truce, the Israeli occupation forces continued with their airstrikes and air raids against Palestinians. Over 40 air raids and airstrikes and tank shelling had occurred today or been carried out by the Israeli occupation forces on different areas of the Gaza Strip, which left around 15 Palestinians killed and over 50 wounded. Among these 15 are even municipalities workers who were trying to connect water lines for residents in the areas that they or the border areas that did not receive water for more than 2 weeks now. They were shot and killed by the Israeli tanks. Also, another 2 workers from the electricity company were attacked by a tank, by an Israeli tank, as they were trying to connect power to a neighborhood near Shuja'iyya area. They were shot but they did not or was was not hit, or there was no injuries reported. They managed to run away. So today's attacks were about 40 attacks by the Israeli occupation forces. Now these attacks occurred till late hours in the afternoon. But since that time until now, relatively speaking, we can say that there has been a sense of calm in the situation, especially after there were contradicted news from the Israeli sources saying that once they approved the humanitarian cease, another day would say no, they rejected it. There was a cabinet meeting at 5 p.m. today, but no statement was released after this meeting. Also, there was Israeli sources saying that they approved the 24-hour humanitarian aid, but at the same time they carried out with these strikes and air raids. At the same time, and since the hours of the beginning of the evening and around iftar time till now, relatively speaking, as I said, we can say that the situation is calm. Palestinians here feel that the Israelis maybe are going to approve or might approve this 24-hour humanitarian ceasefire, as they have not carried out any more air raids or airstrikes, although they are being cautious and not going near the borders. There was an attempt about 1 hour ago to go to eastern Shijaiya, where a family wanted to go back to their home, maybe to collect some of their clothes and items. The Israeli tanks fired against them, which means that the Israelis do not want the Palestinians to return to their areas or border areas in particular. But inside the city, there has been no air raids or airstrikes for at least 5 hours now.
Okay, now give us the latest concerning the resistance's counteroffensive.
Yes, the Palestinian resistance groups, on the other hand, had announced the beginning of the 24-hour humanitarian ceasefire at 2 o'clock p.m. today. After that, the Palestinian resistance groups did not fire or launch any rockets or initiate the fire or rocket launching against the Israeli forces. But at the same time, as the Israeli tanks and artillery and air raids hit the area, the Palestinian resistance groups on the border retaliated and fired back. Also, they resisted some of the tanks' attempts in order to enter some of the areas or move on a couple of meters inside the Palestinian territories. But the but Hamas resistance groups and the other factions prevented them, and there were clashes, gunfire, and even a battle going on, especially in Hayy Tufah area, Shijaiya, Zaytun, and also Khuza'a and Zanna area in Khan Yunis. Around iftar time, Israeli occupation forces had carried out several air raids, but to agricultural areas in the area of Rafah, with no injuries reported. But since that time, Palestinian resistance groups seem to be committed to the truce. Also, the Israeli side seem that they are on the way or on the verge of approving this humanitarian truce, especially when there was news saying that the Israeli occupation forces operation in the Gaza Strip has finished and that they had achieved their goals and they might begin withdrawing tonight. That was some of the news that some of the media had handled late hours this evening, but so far no Palestinian official had confirmed, neither an Israeli side confirmed as well.
Okay, Bassem, what are the conditions at UN compounds where Gazans are reportedly heading to for safety?
People on the town borders actually now they just surrender or believe that the Israeli occupation forces will continue to hit them if they return to their home, especially today and during the humanitarian truce that the Israeli initiated and said that they want this humanitarian aid. They also shot gunfire at the Palestinians who returned to their homes, clearly saying or indicating that yes, this is a humanitarian ceasefire, but no, not for the border areas or border border towns or even for the tunnels. Now, Palestinians across the border have fled towards the city. UN schools, maybe family, maybe relatives, maybe friends' homes as well. Also, they fled to mosques, even churches as well. But today, as they tried to return back, all they found was massive destruction. All their homes have been demolished and destroyed. Also, homes that have not been completely destroyed have been partly destroyed, that they cannot even live in it anymore. So they realized that it was really hard for them to return back. So they fled or returned back in the areas that they came from towards the central of Gaza City. But to be honest, no shelter, as I mentioned multiple times before, no shelter. There's no shelter here in Gaza, no safe place, even from the Israeli air raids. Speaking about schools, mosques, hospitals, all are a target for the Israeli warplanes.
Okay, Balsam, thank you for that update. Balsam Al-Atrash there, our correspondent in Gaza. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif conducted a hefty round of telephone diplomacy to rally support and humanitarian aid for Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. Zarif spoke with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, and regional leaders, stressing that the priority was to get food and medical aid into areas worst hit by Israeli military offensive. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that the Egyptian proposed truce is the only viable option to end the war on Gaza, as he claimed that Hamas violated the recent ceasefires in an interview with NBC News.
5 ceasefires acted upon them. Hamas has rejected every single one of them, violated them, including 2 humanitarian ceasefires, which we accepted and implemented in the last 24 hours. The Egyptian initiative is the only game in town. And the Egyptian initiative will also enable us to get what I think are the prerequisites for a sustainable period of quiet. And that requires, in essence, the demilitarization of Gaza. That is, we have to demilitarize it from the weapons that Hamas has put in there.
And to get some more analysis on this, on these latest developments in Gaza, we have political analyst Mr. Jackson Ellers. Mr. Ellers, good to have you with us today. So how plausible is a ceasefire as a solution to this Israeli offensive against Gaza?
The Israelis are clearly not a reliable partner in this process. The peace agreement that Netanyahu there is referring to is a peace process that was meted out between Egypt and Israel without any inclusion of Palestinian elements, least of all Hamas, who in 2006 was legitimately elected to power, and then in 2007 wrested control from Fatah in Gaza. So this is not going to happen, in large part because Hamas and the Palestinian people in Gaza realize that in order to have a real peace, you have to have the conditions for a lasting peace, and that's not on the table from the Israeli-Egyptian side, in part because Hamas and all of the let's say the power brokers in Gaza understand that in order for this to work, then the blockade, the 7-year siege of Gaza has to stop. That is a precondition from the Hamas side, and it's not an unreasonable request considering this absolute let's say debilitating nature of this open air prison of 1.8 million people in Gaza that have not been able to get the most basic of things in the last 7 years. So I don't see this Israeli backed peace plan coming into fruition.
Okay, and looking at these massacres that the Israelis have committed, the number of children, of women that they have killed in this offensive, it's clear that they don't just want to get these rockets to stop coming in from Gaza. So what is it that the Israelis really want out of this offensive?
as you stated, that they're talking the propaganda line coming from the Israeli government is to destroy the tunnels, and in fact, the scary thing is the overwhelming public support in Israel for this offensive, despite, as you call them, massacres. It's absolutely the right term. Massacres is what's going on in Gaza. It's unconscionable. And so when you're talking about what it is the Israeli military and the Israeli leadership really want out of this, they're talking about a 3-kilometer buffer zone from the border to certain areas. They want to increase. I see this as a land grab, I really do. So I think the idea is to create a situation where, in order for there to be a ceasefire on their end, they maintain troop presence in a certain area and once again enact a sort of policy of taking more land from Palestinian territories through the guise of warfare, and that it's perhaps the most criminal thing that you can imagine. This idea that they want to grab more land, or they want to create their buffer zones there. So I mean, I'm not totally clear, and no one is really totally clear about the real underlying motives of the Israeli government and military in this process. Certainly, from a weapons perspective, the more weapons you fire, the more you can buy, and war, of course, we know is a business. So the idea is that if you're getting rid of your munitions, then you're going to need to get new munitions. That's good for business. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that are at play here, and I certainly think that if you, in a conservative estimate, the idea is this is a way of further controlling more land in Gaza, which they pulled out of in 2005. It's a, let's say, an ongoing campaign for land grabbing in the modern era, and past that, they do certainly want to make military blows against Hamas, and they want to try to cripple whatever resistance infrastructure exists. But let's be clear: this is the most Israeli soldier casualties in the last 10 years officially.
Okay, now during a phone call with Netanyahu, U.S. President Barack Obama stressed the need to end all military action in Gaza. Is the U.S. likely to pressure the Israelis to end this military offensive, and how exactly could they do so?
Well, we should be clear that Obama's administration is no friend to Netanyahu, even though as a policy, the United States is unequivocally in support of the Israeli government and the Israeli military in this sense. So I just think that it's a PR nightmare for the United States, who also is not well known for its, let's say, its proportionate use of force. Both the Israeli military and the U.S. military they're well known for the disproportionate use of force. And
yes, but the military aid coming in from the U.S. to the Israelis has done more than enough to supply them with the weapons that they are killing these Gazans with.
Well, I mean, we're not arguing here. What I'm saying is that when you have two powerful militaries who rely on each other for the business of war, then what we're talking about here is the U.S. pressure is more of a political pressure to get Israel to stop. But as Netanyahu said in a press conference today, we need the unequivocal support of the United States of America to get this done. And I believe that with the rhetoric that's happening from the U.S. Congress, that's exactly the kind of pressure that the Obama administration is under, and they're going to capitulate insofar as they see Israel as their main military business ally in the region.
Okay, and what about the resistance? How much of a blow has their counteroffensive been for the Israelis?
Well, as I said earlier, 50 soldiers nearly have been killed. That's unprecedented. It shows that the Palestinian people have a need to at all costs resist this kind of criminal, absolutely inhumane action from the Israeli military. It's resist or die. And so the idea is that in the least they're going to have to resist. So this is something that the Israeli military was not counting on. They figured that they had done a good job of weakening the process, but rockets continue to be fired from the resistance, and the resistance continues to put up stiff defense in these very dense populated areas of Gaza, and the Israelis are not having an easy time of it.
Indeed. Political analyst and Mr. Jackson Ehlers there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Moving on to Libya now, where deadly clashes between militias vying for control of the eastern city of Benghazi have intensified, with more than 36 people killed. Oh, actually, no, we're going to stay in Gaza. We'll get to Libya in just a bit. During the short-lived truce, Palestinians in Gaza rummaged through what was left of their homes after the horrific Israeli assault, which has entered its 20th day and looks set to continue.
Gaza woke up from its 20-day nightmare to the silence of the Israeli cannons, which battered the strip with a reckless assault on the civilian population. Displaced Palestinians used the temporary truce to walk over the rubble that was once the Shujaiya neighborhood, one of many completely razed to the ground, inspecting what was left of their homes. Many of them had little time to pack up any of their belongings, as Israeli bombs rained down on them without warning, killing hundreds on that fateful day.
When the Israeli airstrike happened, we were sitting at home, preparing for Ramadan. The bombs fell around our home, so we ran to our relatives amid the shell fire, as it's safer there. Today is the first time I have returned to Shujaiya district since fleeing. We could not find our home. The scene here is worse than an earthquake or a tsunami could do. Everything around here is totally destroyed.
The bombs started falling around our neighborhood and the mosque. It's really a miracle that we escaped. I only remember that I heard the sound of bombs approaching, so I grabbed my children and ran outside. We did not have time to consider whether or not to drive the car. There were also many other civilians fleeing with us. The bombs were raining down just around us, and some were wounded or killed. There were dead bodies all across the streets.
The horrific scenes seen on television sets across the world bore witness to the brutality of the Zionists, with women and children comprised the majority of their victims. For those who managed to survive the airstrikes, it wasn't easy. Understaffed hospitals were overcrowded as they treated the wounded, at least 6,000 of them, with the limited medical resources they have at their disposal.
So far, 168 children have died in our hospital due to Israeli military operations, and more than 1,250 others have come here for treatment. That means children account for 42% of the death toll and 54% of the injured.
But that was it as far as a respite given to the Palestinians. Now, the Zionist regime resumed the barbaric assault on Gaza, and will likely add to the rising death toll, which has already surpassed 1,050 people.
Thousands of protesters from countries spanning both the continents of Europe and Asia took to the streets to condemn the ongoing brutal Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip and to call for the lifting of the Zionist blockade of the coastal enclave.
As the Zionist regime continues its war crimes against Gaza, protesters from around the world united in one voice, calling for an end to the bloody Israeli offensive on the besieged enclave.
If the same, exactly the same, what is being done today in Gaza has been done anywhere else in the world, the United States, European countries, they would raise with one voice to say that this is a crime against humanity. But when it comes to Palestinians, no one raises any voice. So we're here like to say why we don't behave the same when it comes to Palestinians.
Wir demonstrieren heute hier für den Frieden in
We are
Gaza.
demonstrating for peace in Gaza. This massacre finally has to come to an end after 66 years.
Authorities in Paris had imposed a protest ban. However, thousands of demonstrators decided to defy the law and instead took to the streets in support of Gaza. The protests soon turned violent, with riot police using tear gas against the crowds and arresting at least 40 people. Meanwhile, in Geneva and London, anti-Israeli sentiment was also running high. In Asia, hundreds of pro-Palestinian demonstrators with flags and placards marched through Hong Kong, carrying signs reading "Stop the War."
What's happening in Gaza is completely inhuman. You don't have to be a Muslim, you have to just be human. Just see what's happening in Gaza. You have military, Israeli military, they are killing civilians, children. What are they trying to prove actually? What they are trying to put their muscle power for? What they will achieve by this actually?
Only way to stop it is through massive collective action by the people, not only in Palestine, but also the Jewish population in Israel, and also, most importantly, us, those who are standing out in solidarity internationally with the people in Gaza.
I need to make it very clear that we're not against Judaism, but against Zionism. We know, of course, that not all Israelis agree with what is happening. We know, of course, that not all Jews agree with what is happening. We are here because we support human rights and because we finally want peace.
The vicious Israeli onslaught on the besieged Gaza Strip has entered its 20th day, with over 1,050 Palestinians having been killed so far and more than 6,000 others injured. And as the Israeli onslaught escalates by the day, anti-Zionist feeling and protests like these look set to continue around the world.
The anger over the indiscriminate killing of Palestinians in Gaza by Israeli occupation forces has raged across the world, and this is no more apparent than in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Our Tehran correspondent Hussein Dabash attended a rally denouncing the brutality of the Zionist regime.
As the Israeli entity continues its aggression on the besieged Gaza Strip, the international community's anger continues to grow, including here in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Dozens of people on Sunday in the Iranian capital Tehran have held a pro-Palestine rally in front of the French embassy. The protesters came out to condemn Paris's unconditional support to the Israeli entity and its current ongoing aggression against the Palestinian people in the besieged Gaza Strip. Slogans were shouted against the recent French government's attacks on a pro-Palestinian rally in France where dozens were arrested and injured. The protesters also called on France to do more for the Palestinian people.
We believe that the French state is speaking about the freedom of speech, but he doesn't allow French people to protest against Israel crimes, Israel genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip. You are speaking about the freedom of speech, but you don't allow your people to protest. Your people, not Iranian, not Arab, not Muslims, your people. You are the base of democracy. You are the country of democracy, country of freedom. You say that we are the mother of democracy in the new world, in the modern world. But you are supporting the Israel.
We are here to call on France to stop its double-standard so-called democracy and to do more for the Palestinians. The Palestinian people are dying every day, and when the French people want to voice their concern, their government attacked them for holding a rally. The French government should be ashamed of its actions.
Despite the scorching heat of around 38 degrees Celsius, students stood in front of the French embassy to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people. The Iranian government took measures ahead of time to fortify the embassy with dozens of security forces just in case the protests got out of control. This protest comes only days after the huge pro-Palestinian International Quds Day rallies, where millions in Iran and across the world took to the streets once again to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people. This is the latest protest in a string of demonstrations against the Israeli entity's ongoing aggression on the Palestinian people since it began earlier this month. The organizers of this event say that more protests will be held in the coming days. Reporting for Al-Ittijah TV, Hussein Dabash. Tehran.
And coming up next here on AEE TV. Russia slams the new round of EU sanctions as counterproductive. ISIS militants take full control of the province of Mosul.
The Iraqi army advances in Mosul after fierce fighting with ISIS militants. Mosul will be liberated soon.
Welcome back. Our top stories are: the Israeli entity continues its horrendous crimes against the people of Gaza despite a 24-hour humanitarian truce. The Palestinian resistance groups respond by firing a barrage of rockets into Israeli settlements. And fierce clashes in Libya between pro-government forces and Islamist militants leave 50 people dead. Now, moving on to Libya, where deadly clashes between militias vying for control of the eastern city of Benghazi have intensified, with more than 36 people killed. Another 23 people were killed in the capital Tripoli after clashes erupted between rival militias. Now, this comes a day after the U.S. evacuated its Libyan embassy staff under air cover, citing serious security concerns.
The dire security situation in Libya has intensified. Deadly clashes between rival armed groups are continuing. In the eastern city of Benghazi, at least 38 people, mostly soldiers, were killed in 24 hours of heavy battles. Ansar Sharia militants launched an assault on the Saika Special Forces headquarters with missiles, prompting the army to respond with airstrike. The clashes spread to the nearby Benina airport. Security sources said 6 missiles exploded there in the space of one day. The violence forced residents in the adjacent Laiti and Musakam neighborhoods to leave their homes. The army, which is struggling to contain militant attacks, has for its part called for Libyan citizens to take up arms and fight along the military. Another 23 people, all Egyptian workers, were killed in the capital Tripoli when a rocket struck their home Saturday during clashes between rival militias battling over the city's main airport. The rapid developments come a day after the U.S. temporarily evacuated its staff from the embassy in the capital.
The United States, together with other countries, one of them Turkey, have decided that because of the freewheeling militia violence that is taking place in Tripoli, and particularly in our case, around, a lot of the violence is around our embassy, but not on the embassy. But nevertheless, it presents a very real risk to our personnel. So we are suspending our current diplomatic activities at the embassy, not closing the embassy, but suspending the activities. And we have moved people on ground to Tunisia, where they will then disperse to other places, where we will continue our diplomatic activities in Libya.
The latest move follows 2 weeks of fighting between rival militias. Fierce battles involving rocket cannon and artillery fire came as close as the embassy compound, the scene of many previous bloody episodes. with rebel groups seeking a federal system in Libya and the central government trying to maintain economic stability, it now seems that the battle for oil will likely widen already deep rifts in the country, which is still trying to rebuild what was destroyed during the 2011 revolution.
And to elaborate more on this, we have Ayo Johnson, an expert in African affairs, who is joining us via Skype from the British capital of London. Mr. Johnson, good to have you with us today. As hostilities escalate in Libya, how close is the country from a dangerous breakup?
Well, the country is definitely at a crossroads, a point of no return, no doubt about that. The escalation of violence, the lawlessness, I think it rings true to the phrase, the Wild West. And we must remember it was the West who interfered in the Libyan politics that ousted Colonel Gaddafi, and ultimately the chaos that we've seen thus far rings true. What's quite clear is that everyone and anyone who can get out of Libya right now is trying to do so.
So with no effective army, how much control has Libya's central government? How much control does the government have in the country?
Well, on paper it has control. On paper it has the mandate and the title, but on the ground it's quite different. This is a government that's lost control. Its army has literally disintegrated. The militias are way too strong. The intensity of the attacks on a daily basis on the people as a whole has really made the Libyan government look very fragile and frail. And to that extent, requesting and seeking assistance internationally, which has not really materialized. We've got the UN running away. We've got African-led forces not being able to deploy effectively. We've got the British and the Europeans and the Americans alike who've pledged support but delivered very little. I'm afraid the Libyans are alone on this, a problem that they created because of the ousting of Gaddafi and the supporting by NATO and the Western allies alike. But ultimately, they have not rang true in terms of their support for this government, which has shown its weakness in all directions.
But I mean, what can the international community really do? I mean, we know that previous attempts by the UN to get both sides on the negotiating table have failed.
Yes, negotiations have failed. In fact, negotiations haven't ultimately started for it to fail, but failed nonetheless. Yes, there's lack of will. Political capital is very, very few and short in supply. And I think everyone seems to have lost patience, lost time. And the Libyan people deserve far more than they're currently getting. And ultimately, the weak government, the escalation of the militias who control vast swathes of the country, who are unlikely to give that up. And of course, the continual fighting makes things very, very difficult, even diplomatically. Diplomatic efforts and those who are on the ground who are meant to bargain or facilitate such activities are also fleeing. Diplomatic missions left, right and center are fleeing the capital as we speak.
And what needs to be done by the country's MPs to move Libya towards democracy?
Well, I think Libyans have got to decide among themselves that they want to stop fighting. That's the first. They've got to collectively agree in terms of all the relevant stakeholders that they want to live in peace. I don't think they've come to that consensus just yet. Libya is evolving, going through a very difficult and painful period in its chapter as a result of the outing of one man, Colonel Gaddafi, who clearly was the man who was holding all these elements, these strings all together. I think Libyans at all would have to determine their own future. It would be wrong for anyone to impose that on them. And I think Libyans will get to a point in time, which we're yet to get to, when they will say enough's enough, we can't fight anymore, we've got to start talking, we've got to ensure that the political will on the ground works, and we've got to start delivering for the people, and ultimately how we can share the vast majority of the wealth that we know exists on the ground in Libya trickle down.
And how much time do you think that it would take for that to happen?
Well, the $6 million question, how long is a piece of string? I don't know. And I think no one else would say they do. Simply because we're so way down the barrel on the point of no return, so down a very difficult path and seeing it very difficult to come back. And you have people who would normally be able to support the weak government fleeing, the Americans, the Brits, Europeans, in fact, even to the UN. So, I mean, it makes you wonder who's left. Just poor Libyans, I'm afraid, facing anarchy and chaos. I think this chaos and anarchy will have to go on for a protracted period of time, to short a time when Libyans can say, well, we've had enough. I think this fighting will have to be stopped by Libyans themselves, other than international effort. But we must remember, where did this all start? It all started because of Colonel Gaddafi that was ousted by NATO and the Western allies alike. And what we do have today is chaos. And those Western allies, which were back then supporting militias to attack Gaddafi, where they're today, all fleeing in all directions.
Indeed. Mr. Johnson, a pleasure to have you with us today. Mr. Ayo Johnson, they're an expert in African affairs.
Thank you.
The Iraqi army has shelled Islamic State militants' possessions in the northern city of Mosul in an attempt to eradicate the presence of the extremists from the city. Military sources reported that at least 35 militants were killed in the attack as the army mobilizes an offensive on the capital of Nineveh in an effort to retake the city 1 month after it was overrun by IS fighters. In the run-up to the religious holiday of Eid al-Fitr, Iraq has beefed up security in the capital and its outskirts amid threats posed by the so-called Islamic State extremist group.
Iraqi police have stepped up security in and around the capital Baghdad in the run-up to Eid al-Fitr, which marks the end of the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan. The Iraqi government launched a plan to secure Baghdad during the Islamic holiday and prevent car bomb attacks by militants from the so-called Islamic State group. To secure the capital, checkpoints at the entrances to the city were reinforced by high numbers of officers, with additional forces deployed to public areas.
A tightened security plan has been worked out to secure people in the streets and give citizens a feeling of safety. God willing, we have intensified patrols, both foot and vehicle patrols, which are carried out by the intelligence section of the 4th Brigade. We have also deployed more forces to the public gardens to help achieve the highest possible degree of security.
According to the United Nations, at least 5,576 Iraqi civilians have been killed so far this year in deadly attacks. In its most detailed account yet of the impact of months of unrest culminating in advances by Takfiri militants led by the Al-Qaeda offshoot Islamic State across the northern and western parts of the country. The sweep of the radical militants through northern Iraq has deepened tensions and raised fears of a possible return to the 2006-2007 sectarian violence. But the authorities are adamant that the Eid al-Fitr holiday will run smoothly.
A plan was devised by officials concerned to ensure protection for the entrances of Baghdad city and reinforce forces at checkpoints. We also directed forces manning checkpoints to thoroughly check cars to deny terrorists the chance to seize the Eid al-Fitr holiday.
The so-called Islamic State has previously claimed responsibility for a wave of bombings in Baghdad, including several blasts on July 19, which killed 27 people. Iraq's million-strong army suffered a major setback, especially in the north, after extremists overran the city of Mosul last month. However, in recent weeks, tens of thousands of Iraqis have volunteered to join the military, following calls by the country's political and religious leaders to rally for the sake of Iraq and its unity.
And militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State are continuing their desecration of religious sites in Iraq's second city of Mosul. After driving out the Christian community from the city, extremists are continuing to destroy churches and mosques that date back hundreds of years.
This is what a campaign to establish an Islamic caliphate looks like. Well, at least according to the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the so-called Islamic State. The group has engaged in a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, expelling Christians and other Muslim sects and destroying Iraq's cultural heritage. The latest casualty was a shrine in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. IS blew up the tomb of Nabi Sheet or Prophet Seth. 2 days ago, militants leveled the shrine of Nabi Yunus or Prophet Jonah. The Nabi Yunus Mosque, a towering structure that housed the shrine, was also destroyed in Thursday's blast. Previously, the IS had carried out numerous bombings, destroying the shrine of the Prophet Daniel west of Mosul, the shrine of one of the grandchildren of the second Caliph Omar bin al-Khattab, as well as several mosques. Numerous churches have also fallen victim to the Al-Qaeda militants' destructive touch. Earlier in the day, militants blew up the Virgin Mary Church in central Mosul, while another, the Holy Spirit Church east of Mosul city, was reported to be rigged with explosives. It's not only just the holy sites that the group has in its crosshairs. There are desecrated graves in the city, where statues of famous figures and other cultural locations have also been destroyed. Perhaps the biggest victim in all this is the idea of coexistence between different religion and confessions in Iraq. The violence in the de facto Iraqi capital of the caliphate has forced thousands of Iraqi Christians to pour out of Mosul. They have been given an ultimatum to either convert to Islam, pay a tax, flee, or face death. Mosul was once a symbol of religious intermingling and tolerance in Iraq, but with the arrival of Islamic State militants, it seems that the idea of tolerance is becoming a distant memory.
Now, Russia has slammed a decision by the European Union to impose further sanctions against Russian officials and companies over the crisis in Ukraine, claiming the move represents a step towards a breakdown of relations between the East and West.
A ceasefire within a certain range was agreed in eastern Ukraine, but in the vast area outside, the shelling has continued. The latest assault came in the Donetsk town of Horlegva, where Ukrainian tanks pounded residential areas. Dozens of residents were among the dead and injured. Their houses demolished, with those who survived the strikes choosing to flee the area. But just as the Ukrainian army stepped up its crackdown, reports emerged that up to 40 servicemen have laid down their arms and sought asylum across the border in Russia. The military refused to comment on what appears to be the personnel's refusal to kill their countrymen. Meanwhile, in neighboring Russia, a new round of EU sanctions was met with the strongest condemnation yet. Russia slammed Brussels' decision, adding that it would be welcomed by international terrorists, an accusation accompanied by what Moscow views as European bloc edging closer towards a complete suspension of all forms of interaction with Russia. But it was not only the EU that bore the brunt of the criticism. Similar rhetoric was launched against Washington, which was also accused of leading a slander campaign against Russia in the region. The US has for long accused Moscow of exacerbating the conflict in Ukraine, but Russia says it is still waiting any proof to substantiate these claims. But if anything, the rift is expected to deepen. The EU has announced it is deploying what it termed as a non-military mission to assist Kiev in implementing reforms and the rule of law in the East. The move will inevitably fuel Moscow's fury at what it perceives as blatant meddling in the conflict-torn region.
Egyptian troops have killed 14 Islamists in shootouts in the restive Sinai Peninsula. The army also destroyed 13 tunnels linking the Sinai Peninsula to the Gaza Strip, seen as a major lifeline for Palestinians living in the besieged enclave.
Egyptian forces backed by armored vehicles launched a major operation in the Sinai Peninsula, leading to guerrilla-style clashes which left 14 Islamist militants dead. Egyptian army sources announced that 47 people were arrested in the clashes that state news agency MENA reported broke out near Sheikh Zuweid in northern Sinai. During a separate operation, the army also destroyed 13 tunnels, taking to 1,639 the overall number it has laid waste to. Egyptian security forces claim that Sinai tunnels are used to smuggle arms and money to the Israeli besieged Gaza Strip. But for Palestinians living in Gaza, tunnels hold a great importance, as it's the only way to supply the enclave with much-needed medical and aid supplies. Also, 4 children were killed when a mortar round crashed into their home in El Jura, a suspected bastion of Islamist militants. Officials said the mortar attack apparently targeted soldiers and police. combing the area for militants who had shot dead 2 senior officers. Militant attacks have surged since the ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi in July 2013, whom militants have a great sympathy for. The government says the militants have killed nearly 500 people, most of whom security personnel, since Morsi's ouster. Militant groups say their attacks are in retaliation for a police crackdown on Morsi's supporters that has so far seen more than 1,400 people killed in street clashes.
Now, recapping our top stories. The Israeli entity continues its horrendous crimes against the people of Gaza despite a 24-hour humanitarian truce. Palestinian resistance groups respond by firing a barrage of rockets into Israeli settlements. And fierce clashes in Libya between pro-government forces and Islamist militants leave 50 people dead. That's it for today. Have a good night.